Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel for being here today. As unpleasant and as unfortunate as this debt issue is in Puerto Rico, I'm actually glad that we're here in Congress talking about debt, and I hope that we'll have more serious discussions about debt. I say that based on the fact that if you look at the debt per capita in Puerto Rico, $115 billion over roughly 3.5 million people, that's just under $33,000 per person. If you look at the debt here in the United States, $19.2 trillion over 323 million people, that's over $59,000 per person. So we have a debt per capita 81% higher than the territory of Puerto Rico. This may be the classic example of worrying more about the plank in our own eye than the speck in our neighbor's eye. That said, I think we can learn from history. Any of us who have made an investment have probably read the small print that says past performance is not an indicator of future performance. My state of Arkansas has a statistic that I'm not very proud of. We were the last state to default on our debt. Happened in 1933. Happened after the state had invested heavily in bonds for infrastructure, a couple of natural disasters, crash of the stock market, and the state found itself in a very precarious situation. When we talk about bankruptcy, I think to the common person, our state was bankrupt, but we didn't have Chapter 9 bankruptcy protection. One historian wrote that we were flat broke. The state treasurer said at one point in time the balance in the state budget was $4.92. Arkansas suffered through that. They took a substantial hit to their bond rating. It was actually 1949 before the state ever issued another bond, but through that we also put better fiscal policies in place. We had a balanced budget act that was passed. I was serving in my state legislature in 2011 when many states were having fiscal issues. Our state was actually cutting taxes and had a surplus budget because of the pain that we had suffered many years ago and the reforms that we'd put in place. So, Mr. Weiss, other than the fact that Puerto Rico has not fixed their problem, what is the emphasis for the federal government to interject itself into the Puerto Rican debt issue? And I remind you, this is a federal government that's 81% per capita more in debt than the government that we're trying to help.
Federal government borrows on a 10-year basis at 1.75%. Puerto Rico is borrowing in excess of 12%. In fact, it's not borrowing at all right now because it's shut out. We have three interests. Number one, we believe that the safety and economic well-being of the 3.5 million Americans in Puerto Rico is at stake. Essential services are today being curtailed, hospitals are being shut, and out-migration has accelerated to the extent that 2.5% of the Americans in Puerto Rico are now coming into the mainland every year. We are inextricably bound to Puerto Rico. How they got there is not a topic of today's discussion. There is a long history of mismanagement that extends back decades, but the complexity and extent of this debt crisis is such that it falls on Congress to act in order to set Puerto Rico back on the right path.
Okay. And Mr. Kent, even if a future Congress tried to use this legislation to establish precedent for a Chapter 9 protection for states and potentially violate the Constitution in doing so, would that Congress still not have to pass legislation? And is there not precedent that establishes no Chapter 9 protection allowed for sovereign states? That question has been asked many ways. It's another attempt.
Certainly Congress would have to authorize it, and as I said before, I think the constitutional difficulties are so severe that it's hard for me to imagine how it could possibly be constitutional with regard to the states. There's contracts clause, there's sovereign immunity issues, and then there's also issues with 10th Amendment and state sovereignty being invaded. So I just don't see how it could happen.
And Mr. Miller, I may have time to get this question out there. Would this legislation cause a ripple effect in the bond market?
No, I think the opposite. I think it would be a calming effect on the bond market.
Okay, and opposite of that, if there's nothing is done, would it cause a ripple in the bond market?
The risk is higher. The risk is higher if nothing gets done.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I recognize myself for 5